Argentina is not simply a country, it is a collective soul carved by centuries of glory, tragedy, resilience, and reinvention. From the prehistoric echoes of its valleys to the chants of the crowds in the Plaza de Mayo, its history unfolds like a great living mural, vibrant, full of scars and dreams. This documentary is a sensorial journey through time, an odyssey in which we meet the titans who walked their ancient lands, the people who loved their land before it had a name, the liberators who challenged empires, and the ordinary citizens who, day after day, wove the destiny of their nation with hope. This is the story of Argentina, and it begins long before it was even called that. Millions of years ago, long before the first word was spoken on these lands, Argentina was barely an idea in the geology of the world. It was part of the colossal supercontinent Gondwana, a landmass that united what we now call South America, Africa, Australia, and Antarctica. But like everything in history, this unity was short-lived. The continents began to separate. The oceans opened wounds in the land, and in that slow and brutal movement, a region emerged that was beginning to define itself. The Andes rose like a sacred backbone in the west, a natural wall that would forever mark the country's silhouette. To the east, rivers began to open up like pulsating veins. The Paraná, the Uruguay, the Pilcomayo. A vital system was born, a web of life that would shape both the land and its future inhabitants. The climate danced between ages of fire and ice. To the north, subtropical forests emerged as jungles vibrant with sounds and colors. In the south, Patagonia was born under the invisible sculpture of the wind, with its endless steppes and glaciers carving valleys that still recount their antiquity. The Pampas, in the heart, emerged as a promise. Fertile land, eternal plain, the future breadbasket of the world. But this land wasn't empty. The first protagonists were giants from another time. In Patagonia, colossi like the Argentinosaurus walked with the slowness of a moving mountain, while predators like the Giganotosaurus stalked the shadows. After their extinction, titanic mammals arrived: the Megatherium, a ground sloth measuring up to 4 meters, and the Smilodon, the legendary saber-toothed tiger. As the planet changed, glaciers advanced and retreated, shaping the geography with icy hands. From this dance were born lakes, rivers, valleys, and the impressive Perito Moreno Glacier, which still moves today with the patience of centuries. It was as if the Earth were preparing its stage, readying its curtain for the great human work that was about to begin. Every stone, every mountain, every stream had a purpose. This land wasn't simply a space, it was a character within itself. One that waited, motionless but expectant, for the arrival of its first dreamers, its first nomads, its first peoples. And then it happened. Because when humans first set foot on this soil, history stopped being written in rocks and began to be told in footprints. And that would change everything forever. When the first human beings arrived in the territory we now call Argentina, history ceased to be told by glaciers and fossils and began to be written by human hands. They were hunters, gatherers, nomads who followed the trail of great extinct beasts. They traversed valleys, crossed raging rivers, and left their mark in deep caves and silent ravines. They had a visceral connection with the land. For them, the environment was not a resource, but a living being. And in that deep connection with nature, the first American worldview was born. The Cave of Hands in remote Patagonia is more than an archaeological site. It's a living page of a history that still beats beneath the rock. The printed hands, red, black, white, are not just art, they are identity. These figures frozen in time speak of rituals, of belonging, of an ancestral need to say, "Here we are." In a world without writing, the wall was the paper, and the pigment, the voice. And in that voice, the indigenous peoples began to sing the history of their land. Northwest Argentina, was the heart of advanced cultures influenced by the Incas. In the arid mountains of the Puna, the Diaguitas and Calchaquías built agricultural terraces, irrigation canals, and stone fortresses like El Xincal. They were organized peoples with defined political and religious structures and an agricultural knowledge that defied the hostile terrain. There, where the sun scorched and the wind whipped, a civilization flourished that knew how to transform adversity into sustenance. In the Pampas region, the Querendí lived a more nomadic life. Masters of the boleadora, they roamed the countryside chasing deer, fishing in streams, and gathering roots and fruits. Their physical strength and combat prowess surprised even the first European conquerors. Although less monumental than other cultures, their knowledge of the land and their ability to adapt were their greatest strengths. To the south, the Tehuelches dominated Patagonia with a wisdom that came from the cold. They were tall, resilient, and had an almost intuitive knowledge of the winds, the skies, and the migrations of the guanacos. They lived in constant motion, guided by the moon and the seasons. Even further south, in Tierra del Fuego, the Selknam and Yamana braved the ice and solitude. They navigated in canoes, hunted in silence, and dressed in paintings and symbols that seemed taken from a parallel universe. In the northeast, the Guarani planted roots in the middle of the jungle. Farmers of cassava, corn, and yerba mate, they lived in a community, guided by wise peasants and a spirituality that connected heaven and earth. Their god Tupa was not a distant being. He was part of the world, the river, and the bird's song. Their language, their music, and their spiritual legacy live on in Argentine culture today. They were diverse peoples, but united by something essential: absolute respect for the land. All these people lived in harmony with their surroundings, until one day, something appeared on the horizon that would change their lives forever. Ships, flags, men in armor coming from the other side of the world. The arrival of the Europeans wouldn't be a simple visit. It would be an earthquake, and nothing would ever be the same again. History is about to break. When the Spanish ships landed on the coast of the Rio de la Plata in 1516, they didn't just bring men and weapons. They brought another world. They brought a different way of viewing time, of understanding the land, of praying, of waging war, of living. The arrival of Juan Díaz de Solís was the first formal contact between two civilizations that until then had existed without knowing one another. The encounter was brief and tragic. The Charrúas, fierce defenders of their territory, confronted the outsiders with ancestral courage. Solís and his crew were annihilated. The land spoke clearly. Here, it would not surrender without a fight. But the Europeans would not stop. In 1526, Sebastian Cabot tried again. He explored rivers, searched for gold, left traces. He founded Fort Sancti Spiritu, the first European settlement in the region. But tensions with the indigenous peoples grew. The fort was destroyed. The land continued to resist. However, Spanish ambition knew no respite. In 1536, Pedro de Mendoza arrived with a colossal
Thousands of
expedition,
men.
horses, provisions, dreams of founding an eternal city. Thus was born the first Buenos Aires. But it would not last. The Querendís, heirs to the Free Pampas, did not accept the invasion. At first, there was exchange, then distrust, then fire. The indigenous siege of the city was relentless. They cut off supplies and attacked relentlessly. Famine devoured the Spaniards from within. Pedro de Mendoza, sick and defeated, abandoned his dream and died on the return journey. Buenos Aires was abandoned, burned, forgotten. It was a ghost before it was born. More than 40 years would pass before anyone would try again. In 1580, Juan de Garay refounded Buenos Aires with a different vision, more austere, more strategic. This time, the colony caught on. More solid agreements were established with the indigenous peoples. Streets were laid out, churches were erected, the land was cultivated, but the conquest wasn't just a foundation, it was an imposition. Religion, language, laws, and social structure were carried like torches to illuminate, and sometimes burn, what had once lived freely. The indigenous peoples were displaced, enslaved, and converted. Some resisted to the bitter end, others adapted to survive. But all, in one way or another, were marked by the iron of conquest. The religious missions, the encomenderos, the cabildos, symbols of a new order emerging from the ruins of the old. The land began to speak Spanish, to pray in Latin, to die for gold. The conquest process was not uniform. Each region experienced its own tragedy. Some resisted longer, others fell quickly, but all shared a common wound, the brutal clash between two worlds. And while in Europe there was talk of evangelization and civilization, in America the weight of loss was felt. Yet, from those ruins, something new would also emerge. A mestizo identity, a people in formation, a history that was just beginning to be written. And while Spain consolidated its dominance, something even greater was brewing. An imperial structure that not only dominated, but also organized. A new chapter was opening, that of the viceroyalty. For more than 2 centuries, the region we now call Argentina was under the rule of a distant empire. From Lima, capital of the viceroyalty of Peru, the orders governing the lives of the settlers were issued. Buenos Aires, despite its geographical importance, was barely a forgotten terminal. But the Rio de la Plata was a sleeping giant, and Spain, slowly, began to take notice. In 1776, with its focus on trade and defense, the crown decided to create a new viceroyalty, that of the Rio de la Plata. Buenos Aires, until then marginal, became the capital. Suddenly, the city filled with viceroys, soldiers, bureaucrats, and merchants. The port began to breathe. Goods flowed. Power was concentrated. Argentine history took a leap forward. But this growth was not homogeneous. Colonial society was divided by invisible but ironclad lines. Peninsular Spaniards held high office. Creoles, born in America, wealthy but without political power, were beginning to look askance. Further down the ladder were mestizos, indigenous people and African slaves, a pyramid of privilege sustained by inequality, and the seeds of conflict were silently germinating. Despite the restrictions imposed by Spain, smuggling became a common practice. English and Portuguese ships secretly exchanged goods. The port became a clandestine artery of wealth, and this economic autonomy fueled a dangerous idea. What if we could govern ourselves? Culture was beginning to flourish. Social gatherings, cafes, and artisanal newspapers became forums for discussion. Enlightenment ideas arrived from France and the United States. The notion of freedom, of rights, of independence began to permeate the minds of young Creoles. It was a whisper at first. Then it became a shout. The viceroyalty was a gilded cage. It had power, it had commerce, it had order, but it also had cracks. And when Europe entered into crisis, with Napoleon invading Spain and exiling its king, the colonial world trembled. Who to obey now? What authority did a viceroy have if his king no longer ruled? The answers would not be long in coming. And when they arrived, they did so with the force of a revolution. Because in 1810, the streets of Buenos Aires roared, and the empire began to crumble. May 25, 1810, did not dawn like any other day. For days before, the Cabildo had been the scene of tension, debate, and conspiracies. The news that the Junta of Seville, the last bastion of Spanish power, had fallen left Viceroy Cisneros without legal support. The question raged in the squares and in the gatherings. If the king no longer ruled, why continue to obey? The Creoles, led by figures such as Cornelio Saavedra, Mariano Moreno, Manuel Belgrano, and Juan José Castelli began organizing the change. They wanted to form their own autonomous governing junta, albeit still under the veil of loyalty to Ferdinand VII. But everyone knew that this was only the form. The essence was different. Power was beginning to change hands. On May 22nd, the Open Town Council was held. Influential residents, merchants, and military personnel debated furiously. People on the outskirts demanded decisions. Popular pressure was unstoppable. And finally, on May 25th, Cisneros was removed from office. The first junta was born. Buenos Aires began to govern itself. It was the first step in a revolution that would forever change the destiny of the continent. But the revolution was not unanimous. Many provinces remained loyal to the crown. The royalists retreated to Upper Peru. Internal wars broke out. Military expeditions were organized to expand the revolutionary cause. Belgrano marched north, while San Martin quietly prepared his continental strategy. Meanwhile, in Buenos Aires, revolutionary fervor clashed with the reality of power. In 1816, after 6 years of battles, tensions, and changes of government, the Congress of Tucumán was held. There, representatives of the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata formally declared independence. It was no longer just a matter of resistance. It was a matter of existence. A nation was born, free, but not united. Independence brought with it hope, but also a new challenge: how to build a country. The external wars would end, but now the internal ones began. And in these internal struggles, Argentina would experience its most chaotic period. With independence sealed, the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata faced a dilemma. What kind of country did they want to be? The absence of an external enemy gave way to internal disputes, and quickly. The territory was divided between two opposing visions: Unitarians and Federalists. Centralism versus autonomy. Buenos Aires versus the interior. The Unitarians, from the capital, dreamed of a strong, centralized government that would organize the country from the port. They believed that only Buenos Aires had the capacity to lead, thanks to its wealth and international connections. The Federalists, on the other hand, defended provincial autonomy. They wanted to decide for themselves. They had fought for freedom and were unwilling to cede it to a new elite. Civil wars began to devour the newborn homeland. Caudillos like Facundo Quiroga, Estanislao López, and Juan Manuel de Rosas rose as warlords. They were local leaders with military power, popular charisma, and a vision for the country forged in land and blood. The battles were bloody. The pacts were fragile. Unity, a distant utopia. Juan Manuel de Rosas emerged as the great protagonist of this period. Governor of Buenos Aires, he became the strongman of the Confederation. He imposed order through terror. The Mazorca, his repressive arm, sowed fear. But he also defended sovereignty, resisted foreign invasions, and kept internal enemies at bay. Loved and hated, dictator and patriot, his figure marked an era. During his reign, Buenos Aires became an isolated fortress, closed off from the rest of the country. He controlled the port, the revenue, and the trade. Meanwhile, the interior languished, waiting for a voice to unite them. Tensions became unsustainable. And finally, in 1852, the Entre Rios leader, Justo José de Urquiza, defeated him at the Battle of Caseros. Rosas fell. He went into exile, and Argentina had a new opportunity. Now, with the tyrant gone, the country had to decide its final form. Could it finally have a constitution? A government for everyone? History was about to take a new turn. What came next would lay the foundations for the modern country. After the fall of Rosas in 1852, the air of the nation was filled with a dense, almost unbreathable hope. The weight of history was felt. For the first time in decades, the provinces glimpsed the real possibility of a lasting pact. Urquiza, victorious at Caseros, summoned the country's representatives to Santa Fe to draft a constitution. It was time to build the legal foundations of a nation that had been born amidst battles, but still did not know how to live in peace. The Constituent Assembly of 1853 became the beating heart of that new dream. Inspired by the American model and Republican ideals, the constituents crafted a bold document: freedom of the press, freedom of worship, equality before the law, and separation of powers. The Constitution was more than a legal text. It was an act of faith, a desperate attempt to stem the chaos with words, to turn wounds into norms. But Buenos Aires, proud, powerful, and hurt, refused to sign. It refused to give up its control over customs, nor to share its preeminence with the rest of the country. It seceded. It founded an independent state. For almost a decade, Argentina was two countries: the Confederation, with its capital in Paraná, led by Urquiza, and Buenos Aires, isolated but wealthy, governed with a firm and calculating hand. The tension between the two worlds became unbearable. Finally, in 1861, the conflict erupted at the Battle of Pavón. Although it wasn't a decisive military victory, it was a master political move. Buenos Aires, under Bartolomé Mitre, prevailed. The rebel province went on to lead the unification effort. Mitre was elected president in 1862. The country finally had a constitution, a capital, and a president. But it also bore the scars of a forced union. Under Mitre, a period of national consolidation began. Education was promoted, immigration was encouraged, and investment in infrastructure was made. But the provinces, once again, were relegated. Real power remained concentrated in the port city. Even so, the idea of Argentina as a nation was beginning to take root. Slowly, painfully, the country was learning to unite. And while the state took shape, the world changed. Global trade expanded. Europe looked hungrily to the riches of the South. The next stage would be one of economic integration, of growth, of a transformation that would take Argentina to the podium of the great promises of the 19th century. But the road to splendor would be paved with sweat, with blood, and with immigrants. Between 1870 and 1914, Argentina underwent a process of transformation so dizzying it seemed like a spell. In less than half a century, a rural, sparsely populated country, fractured by war, became an agricultural export powerhouse, admired in Europe, courted by British capital, and filled with dreams. It was an age of splendor. The country grew at the pace of trains, wheat, and meat. The countryside flourished. Cities multiplied, and waves of immigrants arrived like an incessant tide. Millions of Italians, Spaniards, Germans, Poles, Russians, French, and Arabs disembarked the ships with only the clothes on their backs and a name that became Argentine over time. Men, women, and children fleeing poverty, hunger, and war. Here they found work, promises, and land. Many, not all. The promise wasn't the same for everyone, but seeing it from afar was enough to cling to it tooth and nail. Buenos Aires was transformed into a vibrant, modern, eclectic metropolis. Majestic avenues, opera houses, and universities were built. The streets echoed with diverse languages, new smells, and collective dreams. Tenements sprang up in the suburbs, veritable labyrinths of wood and brick, where entire families shared walls, anguish, and celebrations. There, at the crossroads of cultures, the tango was born. Sad, sensual, painful, but proud. A language of the soul. Meanwhile, the agro-export model turned Argentina into the world's breadbasket. Meat-packing plants shipped chilled meat to Europe. Trains crisscrossed the pampas like iron ribs. The elites grew rich, imitated Paris, traveled to London, and spoke French in salons. But the prosperity wasn't for everyone. In the factories, in the fields, in the ports, life was hard. Working conditions were extreme. Abuse was constant. And the response was not long in coming. The labor movement, influenced by European anarchism and socialism, began to organize. Strikes, marches, and protests emerged. Red Week, Tragic Week, and the first unions were formed. It was the other face of progress, the fight for basic rights in a country that exported wealth but distributed little. State violence became the norm, prisons filled with workers and agitators. But the seed of social consciousness had already germinated. Behind the Republic's elegant facade, a latent tension simmered. Modern Argentina was a palace built on fragile foundations, and that fragility would be laid bare when the world erupted into war. Because in 1914, World War I would change everything. And in that new world order, Argentina would have to decide who it was and which side it was on. When the European powers plunged into the abyss of war in 1914, the world trembled. Battlefields were covered in mud and blood. Economies retreated. International trade contracted. And Argentina, still far from the conflict, felt the seismic waves of chaos. It was then that a key decision was made. The country would remain neutral, neither on the side of the Allies nor on the side of the Central Powers. A pragmatic, economic, but also political neutrality. The decision was not unanimous. Within the country, sentiment was divided. The German community, strong and organized, sympathized with Berlin. The British, virtual owners of much of the railway capital, pushed for alignment with London. In the middle, a polarized society. President Hipólito Yrigoyen, leader of the Radical Civic Union, and the first president elected by universal suffrage, defended the neutral position as a demonstration of sovereignty. The war, however, brought contradictory economic consequences. On the one hand, markets were closed. On the other, new opportunities opened up. Local industry grew. Imports decreased. Self-sufficiency became a necessity. Factories were built, and the textile, metalworking, and food sectors were strengthened. It was the embryo of a new economic model that, decades later, would morph into import substitution. But the war also exposed internal fissures. Prices rose, wages fell, hunger hit working-class neighborhoods, strikes multiplied. Irigoyen, though a reformist, did not hesitate to use repression when he believed it necessary. The state intervened. The police acted. Democratic hopes began to dim. One of the darkest episodes was the von Luxemburg affair in 1917. The German ambassador sent secret messages to Berlin, proposing to sink Argentine ships without a trace. When the telegrams were intercepted and published, a scandal erupted. Pressure to enter the war grew, but Irigoyen resisted. Neutrality was maintained. Argentina survived the war without firing a single shot, but not without wounds. The post-war period brought with it a sense of vertigo. The world had changed. Empires were falling. Radical ideologies were emerging. And in the global south, Argentina was asking itself, where do we go from here? What was to come would no longer be a conflict between nations, but within the very soul of the country. In the shadows of the 1940s, as the world was once again ignited by World War II, a phenomenon was brewing in Argentina that would forever change its political, social, and cultural history. Juan Domingo Perón, a shrewd, charismatic military man, deeply attentive to the social climate, emerged from the halls of power as a new figure. He was not a traditional caudillo. He was not a bourgeois or an intellectual. He was something different, and that different fit perfectly with the moment. From his position as Secretary of Labor and Social Security, Perón built bridges with the workers, the dispossessed, the invisible. He listened to them. He made promises. He gave them rights, salaries, vacations, pensions. For the first time, the state spoke to them directly, and they responded with devotion. The labor movement was Peronized before Peronism as such existed. Meanwhile, the elite watched with distrust, fear, and hatred. His relationship with Eva Duarte, an actress from a humble background, marked the symbolic heart of the movement. Evita became the voice of the humble. the living embodiment of a long-delayed social justice. Together, they forged a new national pact. Peronism was not a pure ideology. It was a mystique, a cause, a narrative. And in that narrative, millions of Argentines felt like protagonists for the first time. But Perón's rise wasn't linear. In 1945, his enemies imprisoned him. They thought they had defeated him. But the people took to the streets. On October 17th, workers filled the Plaza de Mayo. They shouted his name. They demanded his freedom. That day became a founding myth. Perón returned, ran for office, won, and the Peronist era began. During his first presidency, Perón nationalized companies, promoted industry, and distributed wealth. The state became the great regulator of the economy and guarantor of well-being. Women's suffrage was enacted. Hospitals, schools, and homes were built. It was a bloodless revolution, but also one without consensus. The opposition was persecuted, the press controlled, and Perón's figure became increasingly omnipresent. In 1955, after a decade of government, a military coup overthrew him. Perón went into exile. Peronism was outlawed, but it didn't disappear. It became a resistance, it became an identity, it became part of Argentina's DNA, and so what seemed like the end was only the beginning of the fight for the soul of the country. Perón's fall in 1955 didn't bring peace. It brought a void, an abyss that no one knew how to fill. The self-proclaimed liberating revolution promised to restore the republic, organize the economy, and reconcile the country. But the first thing it did was ban Perón's name, erase his image, and silence his legacy. Peronism, far from being defeated, became an underground force, a hidden flame that burned brighter in the darkness. The military seized power with the pretensions of savior, but they soon collided with reality. A divided country, a fragile economy, a wounded people. Political prescription generated more hatred, more polarization. Peronist and revolutionary guerrillas emerged. Violence became routine, and each new president seemed to last less time than the previous one. Arturo Frondizi attempted an opening. He was overthrown. Arturo Illia opted for honesty. He was ridiculed and removed from office. Democracy was a withered flower. Meanwhile, Perón remained in exile. From Madrid, he pulled strings, sent cryptic messages, and kept the flame alive. For many, he was a myth. For others, a threat. In the country, social and economic tensions deepened. Young people took up arms. Unions fragmented. The military returned to power time and again. Each coup was justified as necessary. Each one exacerbated the problem. In 1973, after years of chaos, Peronism was legalized. Perón returned amidst a wave of humanity. He was elected president for the third term, but his health was fragile, his figure aging. He died the following year. He left power to his wife, Isabel, an inexperienced woman, surrounded by vested interests, manipulated by shady figures. The country spiraled downward. Political violence reached its peak. Kidnappings, attacks, daily clashes. Fear became commonplace. The economy collapsed. Inflation rampant. Institutions were empty shells. And in 1976, as so often before, the military seized power. But this time, what was to come would be unprecedented, because now the repression wouldn't be visible. It would be clandestine, silent, infinite. On March 24, 1976, the streets were filled with tanks, official announcements, and silence. The military took complete control of the country. Constitutional rights were suspended. Congress was dissolved. The media was censored. All forms of dissent were prohibited. But this time, the repression was neither open nor direct. It was systematic, calculated, and invisible. The darkest period in Argentine history began. State terrorism. The military junta, composed of Videla, Massera, and Agosti, promised order, peace, and efficiency. But behind that technocratic facade, an unprecedented apparatus of kidnapping, torture, and extermination was constructed. Clandestine detention centers sprang up across the country. The ESMA, El Olimpo, La Perla. There, thousands of people were disappeared, without trial, without defense, without return. An estimated 30,000 Argentines were wiped off the map for thinking, for being
opposing,
militant, or for nothing at all. The families waited. They knocked on doors. They cried in silence. Until one day, the mothers of Plaza de Mayo broke that silence. They walked out in a circle with white scarves, with the faces of absent children. They were ignored, persecuted, ridiculed, but they didn't stop. They became a symbol, the voice of those who no longer had a voice, a living memory in times of forced oblivion. Meanwhile, the dictatorship deepened its economic agenda. It opened the country to foreign capital, destroyed domestic industry, and generated a monumental foreign debt. The country became impoverished. Freedoms were a memory. Society lived anesthetized by fear. And just when everything seemed under control, an absurd decision changed everything: war. In 1982, the junta decided to invade the Falkland Islands, a desperate attempt to regain legitimacy. At first, the population supported it, but the illusion was short-lived. The Argentine troops, poorly equipped and poorly led, faced the might of Britain. The defeat was swift, painful, and humiliating. The soldiers returned broken. The myth collapsed. The fall of the dictatorship was inevitable. The streets filled with protests. The economy collapsed. The world watched in horror. And in 1983, democracy returned. But the country was no longer the same. It had survived its longest night, and now it had to learn to live with its wounds. Because memory would be the only path to new hope. In 1983, Argentina once again voted freely. The ballot boxes were filled with one name: Raúl Alfonsín, a radical lawyer, a staunch orator, a believer in democracy and human rights. His administration began with a heroic gesture, prosecuting the military juntas. For the first time in the world, a country tried its own dictators in civilian courts. Images of Videla and company sitting before the courts went around the world. It was an act of courage and a historic milestone. But the transition wasn't easy. The armed forces resisted. There were uprisings, threats, forced agreements. The full stop and due obedience laws limited trials. The disappeared remained absent. Mothers and grandmothers persisted. And the country walked a tightrope between memory and silence. The economy became a nightmare. The hyperinflation of the late 1980s drained pockets and hopes. The price of bread changed daily. Salaries disappeared in hours. The shelves were empty. The state was on the verge of collapse. And in this chaos, a new player emerged: Carlos Menem. Menem, a Peronist from La Rioja, took office in 1989 with a smile and promises of stability. What followed was a brutal transformation. Massive privatizations, trade liberalization, convertibility. 1 peso equals $1. At first, it worked. Inflation disappeared. Consumption returned. But it was an illusion. Behind the order, unemployment, debt, and the concentration of wealth grew. The country became a bubble. It glittered on the outside, but creaked on the inside. By the late 1990s, the model had run out of steam. Unemployment rose, poverty multiplied, and in 2001, everything exploded. Fernando de la Rua's government fell amid pot-banging, looting, and repression. The famous "everyone should go" echoed on every corner. 5 presidents in 1 week. The Corralito. The entire country in a state of shock. Democracy survived, but wounded. There was political freedom, but real hunger. And a new era was looming on the horizon. Because projects are also born from ruins, and Argentina was about to reinvent itself once again. In 2003, amid the rubble of the crisis, a virtually unknown figure emerged: Nestor Kirchner, Governor of Santa Cruz, a lawyer, and an atypical Peronist. He took office with little power, but with great determination. From day one, he set a course: economic recovery, debt relief, and prosecution of repressors. His administration was a blend of pragmatism and epic struggle, of institutional reconstruction and political narrative. Kirchner understood that memory was a banner. He repealed the impunity laws, he reopened the trials, he recovered the voices of the disappeared, he confronted the Supreme Court, the media, and economic sectors, and he won. With a direct discourse and decisive action, he once again put politics at the center of public life. The state, once again, was the protagonist. The economy grew, consumption recovered, poverty declined. The Universal Child Allowance was created. Aerolíneas and YPF were nationalized. Industry was fostered. But polarization also grew. Kirchnerism generated fervent support and visceral rejection. With Cristina Fernández as her successor, the project deepened. More rights, more state, more conflict. During her 2 terms, Cristina made progress in social inclusion, gender equality, and human rights. But she also faced accusations of corruption, concentration of power, and clashes with the agricultural sector and the press. The country was on an emotional roller coaster. Every announcement was historic, every mistake epic. Kirchnerism left no one indifferent. In 2015, the cycle ended. Mauricio Macri came to power with promises of dialogue, efficiency, and modernization. But the international climate, debt, the pandemic, and his own mistakes brought him face to face with reality. The rift remained open, and the country remained divided. But Argentina is like that. It walks on the edge of the abyss, and just before falling, it flies. Because when all seems lost, a new possibility appears, and that possibility has 1,000 names, 1,000 forms. It is crisis, but also creation, and a new figure was already appearing, one that no one expected. In 2023, in a country exhausted by broken promises, a hoarse-voiced outsider appeared, wielding a chainsaw and an incendiary discourse. Javier Milei, a libertarian economist, channeled the frustration of millions of Argentines. He presented himself as the enemy of the state, of the system, of the caste. He promised to dollarize, close ministries, and break with everything. And they elected him. Against all logic, against all odds. Milei didn't come from power. She came from anger, from television sets, from economic papers, from aggressive debates. Her campaign was an explosion of social media, symbols, and a new language. She represented more than just a party. She was a cry, a collective enough, a radical experiment. Once in power, his style broke with everything that had gone before. Clashes with Congress, tension with governors, brutal cuts, unthinkable reforms. His shock plan was divisive. Some saw anger, others saw destruction. The streets were once again filled. The argument was intense. No one could ignore it. The country was teetering between hope and fear. Some celebrated the boldness. Others feared the abyss. Dollarization? Total privatization? A new constitution? The questions were many. The answers, few. But one thing was certain. Argentina was changing again. As always, Milei reawakened old debates. What kind of state do we want? What does it mean to be free? Who pays the costs? And meanwhile, the country continued its tense march, between pot-banging and algorithms, between inheritances and ruptures. The future is unwritten, and that, in Argentina, is always a promise, because this country is a miracle in motion, chaotic, wounded, luminous. And its story, far from ending, is just beginning. Argentine democracy, marked by deep scars, entered the 21st century facing a new challenge: speed. The digital revolution changed the rules of the game. The internet, social media, cell phones, fake news. Information was no longer the monopoly of newspapers or television. Everyone spoke. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a voice. But not everyone listened. And that changed everything. Politics became image, viralization, algorithm. Election campaigns were played out more on Twitter than in the squares. Debates were less profound, but more immediate. Truth became relative. Scandal became routine. Citizenship mutated. It was no longer just about voting. It was about reaction, meme, hashtag. And in this whirlwind of stimuli, collective identity fragmented. Traditional parties were fading. Alliances were ephemeral. Beliefs were adaptable. Outsiders, influencers, and disruptive figures emerged. Some with proposals, others with empty slogans. The electorate oscillated between disenchantment and blind hope. Argentina, once again, was looking for answers in new faces, or in reinvented old faces. But democracy held firm, with errors, with flaws, but it held firm. The elections continued to be massive, passionate, decisive. Congress debated. The justice system, though slow, responded. Civil society, increasingly active, organized struggles for gender, the environment, and mental health. Traditional politics looked on in astonishment. Power was no longer vertical. Young people, digital by nature, were distancing themselves from political parties, but not from politics. They were fighting for causes, for rights, for visibility. Their battlefield was the social media, but also the streets. The Ni Una Menos marches, the mobilizations for legal abortion, and climate activism, all were signs that something was still stirring. Argentine democracy has become noisy, tense, imperfect, but alive. More alive than ever. Because amidst the chaos, the cyclical crises, the economic collapses, one certainty remained. The Argentine people refuse to give up. They argue. They rise. They begin again. And what was to come would be a definitive test of her resilience. Argentine history has always had a secret tool: education. From the first itinerant teachers to the massive public universities, knowledge was seen as a shield, a door, a promise. And in a country where everything trembles, school was the only refuge that, although precarious, remained standing. Public education shaped entire generations. It produced doctors, scientists, artists, workers, and activists. From the dirt classrooms in the north to the centuries-old buildings of the University of Buenos Aires, UBA, the culture of effort and equal access shaped the national identity. Learning also meant resisting, but it wasn't easy. There were cuts, strikes, underpaid teachers, collapsed infrastructure. Even so, the system held on. Because the teachers kept showing up, because the students kept dreaming, because in every notebook there was an invisible flag, and in every school event, a reaffirmation of identity. Culture, sister to education, was another trench. From tango to cinema, from literature to street murals, Argentina has always been a symbolic force. Its artists told the story of the country when no one else would. They denounced, they healed, they remembered. They created beauty in the open air. Under dictatorship or democracy, books continued to circulate. Independent theater never fell silent. Cinema recovered memory. Urban music became the voice of the neighborhoods. And television, with its lights and shadows, shaped generations. Every cultural expression was a way of understanding what was happening and what was missing. Argentine culture is complex, contradictory, immense. It doesn't fit into labels. It's Borges and Indio Solari. It's Gilda and Charlie. It's Lali, Kino, Favaloro, Messi. It's popular, but also sophisticated. It's pain, but also celebration. And like all good culture, it doesn't yield to censorship or the market. Because when everything goes out, art and words rekindle the flame. To talk about the economy in Argentina is to talk about an eternal roller coaster. an emotional, political, and social roller coaster. From the 19th century to the present, the country's economic history repeats itself like a litany. Boom, debt overhang, crisis, adjustment, and boom again. And between each cycle, millions of people struggle to survive. Inflation, that chronic specter, devours plans, salaries, and savings. Financial crises seem inevitable. The dollar, a national obsession, is more than a currency. It's an emotional compass. When it rises, it is feared. When it falls, it is doubted. The Argentine economy cannot be explained by numbers alone. It is felt. Governments of all political persuasions attempted to tame the beast, with liberal, heterodox, gradualist, or shock solutions. But the problem runs deeper. It's structural. An unbalanced productive system, a weak fiscal matrix, a large but ineffective state, a short-termist culture, all of it combined. And yet, people keep going. They work, they undertake, they reinvent. Kiosks survive, fairs thrive, bartering reappears. Odd jobs multiply dignities. Because Argentines don't wait to be saved. They do what they can, and sometimes the impossible. Because living with inflation is like dancing on glass, without stopping smiling. Crises are also moments of creativity, new technologies, cooperatives, and social movements. The grassroots economy has become a key player. Soup kitchens, recovered factories, cartoneros, carton collectors, neighborhood organizations, all sustain what the system abandons. And even in poverty, cultural consumption, solidarity, and ingenuity remain vital assets. The Argentine economy is a constant paradox, but it is also proof of the strength of a people who no longer expect miracles, but never lose faith. And in this invisible fabric of resistance lies the true driving force of the country. What does it mean to be Argentine? Is it the Sunday barbecue, or the endless discussion after dinner? Is it the national anthem on the field, or the resigned complaint on Monday? Argentine national identity is as rich as it is conflictive, a puzzle of origins, passions, traumas, and everyday gestures, a mixture of indigenous, European, and African blood, of cultures that intersected, loved, hated, and built something unique. Argentina conceives itself through excess. Everything is intense. Love, pain, politics, soccer, music, hope. Argentines laugh loudly, argue loudly, love loudly. They live with emotion on their sleeves. They don't compromise on feeling. That's why their crises are dramatic, and their celebrations unforgettable. From a young age, Argentines learn that history isn't linear, that heroes are heroes, but also human, that squares are places of celebration and mourning, that the past is alive, that the future is a leap of faith, and that truth is often constructed from memory. The sense of belonging isn't imposed, it's transmitted at school, in clubs, on national holidays, in the stories of immigrant or Creole grandparents, in shared mate drinks, in endless discussions about everything, in the certainty that, despite everything, this country is worth it. And like all deep identities, it takes on new meaning. It changes. It opens up. Today, Argentinian identity is also trans, Afro, indigenous, migrant, and feminist. It is struggle and diversity. It is inclusion and resistance. It is tradition and transformation at the same time. A country in a permanent state of question. Because Argentina isn't just a territory. It's a way of experiencing the world. Argentina's future isn't a fixed destination. It's a daily construction. Every choice, every decision, every mistake, every hope. It's the classroom of a public school in Jujuy, the lab of a startup in Cordoba, the mural in a village in Rosario, the Mapuche community resisting in the south. The future is now, and it's also what we are willing to change. Technology is here to stay. Artificial intelligence, renewable energy, and scientific knowledge are the new battlefields. Argentina has brilliant minds, boundless creativity, and renowned universities. But it needs opportunities, infrastructure, and planning. The talent is there. The bridge is missing. The fight for the environment has become a priority. Young people across the country are demanding protection for forests, glaciers, oceans, and indigenous communities. Drought, fires, and pollution are no longer secondary issues. The earth speaks, and Argentina listens, even if it's sometimes too late. Feminism changed the political agenda forever. What was once invisible is now urgent. Gender violence, parity, legal abortion, and ESI, compulsory secondary education, all are part of a new social contract. Women, diverse groups, and dissident groups don't just demand things, they build the country. And even with rifts, with irreconcilable differences, with exhausting arguments, Argentina has something that few countries retain: a mobilized, informed, empathetic society, capable of mourning a tragedy and celebrating with a World Cup, capable of hating each other's ideas, but embracing each other in the face of catastrophe. Argentina's future will be what we decide today. It's not set in stone, but it's open. And that uncertainty in this country has always been a possibility. Because if there's one thing Argentine history teaches us, it's that there's never an end. There's always a new beginning. The Falkland Islands are much more than a group of rocks in the South Atlantic. For the Argentine people, they are a scar that bleeds memory, pride, and pain. Since they were occupied by British forces in 1833, the islands have become a national symbol. They appear on maps, in school anthems, in speeches, on the skin of veterans. They represent absence, but also a constant presence. The 1982 war wasn't an act of official heroism. It was a military desperation in the midst of a teetering dictatorship. But for the soldiers sent there, most of them ill-trained teenagers, it was real. The cold, the hunger, the fear, the mud trenches, the sound of airplanes, the early deaths of comrades, and an inglorious return, without attention, without listening. For years, the veterans were invisible, marginalized, treated as remnants of a war that those in power wanted to forget. But they didn't forget. They organized. They spoke out. They bore witness. They wrote. They painted murals. They made their memory a banner. And today, thanks to their struggle, the Malvinas cause is not a military issue. It's a human, cultural, and historical right. In schools, every April 2nd, they are remembered. But their presence goes beyond the anniversary. It is in the streets bearing their names, in the songs, in the tears of mothers still waiting for a grave, in the books that tell history from below, and in the certainty that sovereignty is not disputed, it is built. The Malvinas Islands are also a mirror of how power can use patriotism for horror, but also of how the people can repurpose pain into a dignified struggle. This isn't about hatred, it's about justice, it's about respect, it's about sovereignty not only over land, but over memory itself. The demand remains valid through diplomacy, through education, through art, because the Malvinas are not just a geographical cause, they are an emotional pact between generations, an outstanding debt of history that still awaits settlement in peace. And as long as there is memory, the flame will remain lit. In Argentina, sport isn't just another activity. It's a way of life, a common language that crosses social classes, religions, and generations. From the slums to elite clubs, sport is ritual, catharsis, and identity. And at the center of it all, like an inexhaustible sun, shines soccer. That game that has become a religion here. Fields aren't stadiums, they're temples, where people shout, suffer, cry, and hug. Clubs aren't businesses, they're extended families. Boca Juniors, River Plate, Independiente, San Lorenzo, Racing Club, each with its own mystique, each with its own narrative. Argentine football is about talent, but also grit, technique, but also heart, and above all, people. Diego Maradona embodied that mystique like no one else. Born in poverty, he touched the sky with his feet. He won the 1986 World Cup with an epic performance that overflowed with sporting brilliance. His goal against the English was more than revenge. It was poetry. His career was both glory and tragedy, talent and excess, but always unbridled humanity. Diego wasn't a player. He was a social phenomenon. And then came Messi, the shy boy from Rosario who became a global legend. For years, he was criticized for not feeling the jersey. Until in 2022, with tears, leadership, and football from another planet, he lifted the World Cup in Qatar. It was more than a sporting victory. It was a collective embrace, a national redemption. Argentina, broken by so many things, united for an eternal moment. But Argentine sport goes beyond football. It's the Leonas in hockey, Ginóbili in basketball, Gabriela Sabatini in tennis. The Olympic medals, the Paralympic athletes, the neighborhood clubs that save lives. It's the grassland, the effort, the discipline, the passion. In every corner of the country, there's a boy or girl dreaming of representing their homeland. Not for fame, for love. Because in Argentina, sport isn't a luxury. It's an emotional necessity, a refuge from the storm, a way of saying, we're still alive. And as long as a goal, a pass, a cheer is heard, the country will continue to beat. Beyond the obelisk, beyond the amba, and its incessant lights, there is another Argentina, the profound one, the quiet one, the one that doesn't usually make the headlines, but that sustains the country every day. Its rural towns, mid-sized cities, indigenous communities, endless landscapes. History is also written there, even if it's sometimes not heard. The interior is the land of silent labor, of farmers who rise before sunrise, of rural teachers who travel miles to teach, of doctors who treat in forgotten areas. It is the land of the Patagonian wind, the Chaco heat, the Misiones green, a geography that shapes character. In every corner, there are stories of struggle, of organization, of love for the place. Local fairs, community radio stations, cooperatives, popular festivals, languages, recipes, and ancestral knowledge are preserved there. Planting, harvesting, and raising livestock are done there. But there are also dreams, debates, and studies. The centrality of Buenos Aires has always been a debt, true federalism, an unfulfilled promise. The distances aren't just physical. They're political, economic, and cultural. Often, the interior feels that Buenos Aires decides for everyone, and sometimes it does so without looking or listening. But the interior resists and makes itself heard, with its own voices, with its universities, with its projects. Each province has its pride, its identity, its unique contribution. Córdoba and its rebellion. Tucumán and its history, Mendoza and its wine, Salta and its culture, Formosa, Catamarca, San Juan, all essential. Deep Argentina is the soul of the country. It doesn't seek fame. It doesn't demand recognition. It only asks to be looked at head-on, with respect, because without it, there's no possible future. It's the heart that pumps blood to the entire body. And if that heart is strengthened, the entire country can be reborn. Long before Argentina existed, nations existed. Indigenous peoples inhabited this land with ancestral wisdom. Mapuche, Com, Huichí, Guarani, Diaguita, Comechingon, among many others. Diverse, profound cultures, with their own languages, worldviews, and ways of life. They are not the past. They are the present, even though many have tried to erase them. The conquest and then the state relegated them, dispossessed them, rendered them invisible. Military campaigns, like the Desert War, were sold as epics, but they were massacres, advances on sacred lands, forced displacements, cultural reduction, and yet they resisted. For centuries, they were denied. They were folklorized. They were romanticized. But they were still there, in the mountains, in the rivers, on the edges, preserving their language, their medicine, their spirituality, fighting for basic rights, land, identity, recognition. In recent decades, they began to organize more vigorously. They filed lawsuits, reclaimed territories, and made their voices heard. Intercultural education, indigenous art, and community leadership grew, and with them, a new national awareness of diversity and pluriculture. The land conflict remains central. Ancestral territories are in dispute with large corporations and extractive interests. But indigenous peoples aren't just fighting for acres. They're fighting for a way of life, for water, for the forest, for the right to exist with dignity. Argentina owes a historic debt to its indigenous peoples. A debt that is not repaid with words, but with concrete justice, with real spaces, with active policies, with true respect. Because at the roots of this land, they have always been there, and they continue to be there. Argentina can't be understood through statistics. It's felt, it's breathed, it's suffered, it's celebrated. It's a contradictory, unpredictable, passionate country, capable of falling 1,000 times and getting back up 1,001 times. Its history is painful, glorious, chaotic, but always human, always intense, always its own. From the endless pampas to the glaciers of the south, from the shantytowns to the theaters on Corrientes Avenue, from feminist marches to grass court stadiums, every corner vibrates with an identity that constantly reinvents itself, one that refuses to be pigeonholed. Being Argentine isn't easy, but it's not boring either. It's like living in a magical realist novel where anything can happen. It's living with crisis and hope, with anger and tenderness, with the certainty that no matter what happens, the country keeps beating, like a heart stubbornly faithful to itself. It's the mother who serves the last Milanese with a smile, the kid who plays barefoot, dreaming of being messy, the retiree who never loses his dignity, the grandmother who teaches tango, the worker who gets up at 5, the poet who writes on the sidewalk, the cartonero who waves as he passes by. They all belong to the homeland. Argentina is also those who left, those who emigrated in pain, but still carry the mate, the jersey, the language, those who cry on Skype every birthday, those who dream of returning, because no one ever leaves completely, and no one stops feeling. This country, for all its flaws, has something that can't be bought, imposed, or copied, a collective emotion, an everyday epic, a raw, luminous, visceral humanity. And as long as that emotion remains alive, the story will continue. This isn't just the story of a country. It's the story of an emotion that never gives up. A memory made of small gestures and immense decisions. A homeland told from the mud, from fury, from love. Argentina isn't a straight line. It's a spiral where every turn brings us a little closer to what we can be. Every struggle, every hug, every song sung in the street or on a field is a way of making history. There is no fixed destiny for people. It is built every day with the voices of those who refuse to be silent, with the strength of those who insist, with the tenderness of those who believe in others. What you were, what you are, what you can be, is in your hands. Because Argentina is not the current government or the current crisis. Argentina is your grandmother teaching you how to brew a mate. It is the language you speak, the ideas you defend, the injustice you will not tolerate. It is you. And now that you know this journey, this route between glory and pain, between epic and silence, you can't go back. The story continues, but not from a book, from you, from what you do every day, from how you look, how you speak, how you build. Because it's not just about remembering the past, It's about honoring it with actions, about lifting up what others have sown, about being part of something bigger. So, if this documentary made you feel, think, or vibrate, don't leave it here. Subscribe to the channel to continue discovering other stories that are also yours. Share this content with those who love this land as much as you do. Comment below which part moved you the most, which story changed you. We want to read your stories. We want to hear from you, because this space is yours too. Every click, every word, every minute you spend with us strengthens this community of people who believe in memory, culture, and collective construction. This isn't just a video, it's an invitation to be an active part of something worthwhile. Because history doesn't end, it transforms. Thank you for being on the other side. Thank you for feeling how we feel. Thank you for choosing not to forget. We're still together, because history, now more than ever, is written by all of us. See you next time. We'll see you soon.